Hello again all. Here we are with a review of Chapter 4, which is entitled Continental Empires, and starts on page 91 of your text. And starts with kind of a intriguing story about the witchcraft up in the Massachusetts colony in Tituba, who was a slave who blended in some African and Caribbean voodoo practices, and this sets people in a panic as some freaky things start going on up there. An unstable time as it was, but this kind of sets the brooms flying, if you will, as people get paranoid of witchcraft. So witchcraft was something that existed before this time, but with Tituba, and here was a sketch done much later, about 100 years later, maybe more than that, of what Tituba must have looked like doing her magic on these girls in the colony. But there are definitely a lot of factors that play into this. For one thing, you've got this concern of kind of this voodoo or devil's magic. You've got so much instability. You've got a very religious community that very much believed in the presence of good, and so therefore they're also very much going to believe in the presence of evil. And just like things can get scary and built up today, they certainly did in the 1600s in New England as well. But after that intro, it goes on to some other challenges that the colonies will face. As we look at a map here and kind of where things settled by about 700, the French dominating that interior of what becomes the United States later, Spain down in the south, and the British colonies on the Atlantic coast or the eastern coast. And England's got a lot going on. It talks about how King Charles I would be killed in 1649. It's mentioned on page 93. And so England, with all this going on, they're not able to pay as much attention to the colonies, and that's one of the things that this colonial independence spirit is kind of growing, and that's all going to come back in the 1760s and 1770s, way after this, when people say, whoa, 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 we've been trying to govern ourselves for a long time, and now England's interfering. Mentions more about mercantilism, that I think we've mentioned before, but that idea that the economic theory that if there was a limited amount of wealth in the world, so if one of these countries, like let's say France, gains wealth, then that automatically by default means England and Spain are going to lose it. So these countries are not very trusting of each other. There are going to be tons of wars happening in the 16 and 1700s, largely over these economic theories of mercantilism, that zero-sum game, as it says on page 93. It explains how New York, which had been started by the Dutch, if you remember earlier, has takes that name from the Duke of York after England took over what was New Netherland and the city of New Amsterdam. So much in that area is named, like the Hudson River, for certain Dutch people, but now it would become the Duke of York in the 1600s, James, who later became King of England but was Duke of York at that time. And it goes into some of the other colonies that are founded in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Pennsylvania, a unique one started by the Quakers, officially known as the Society of Friends. It stayed at a Quaker inn one time in England, and the name tags of the employees said Friend John, Friend Sarah, Friend Susan. So that's their title. They're a very egalitarian group. And so, let's see, type out egalitarian for those of you less spelling inclined. More based on equality. They don't believe that you have a high-ranking official who's going to conduct your worship services. They will allow whoever feels led by the Spirit to talk, and that includes women. So that was a pretty revolutionary idea. They are also going to be a group that's persecuted, just as Catholics were in England, just as Puritans were, because they're not of the Church of England. So William Penn, whose family was friends with the monarchy, he's given permission to start this colony called Penn's Forest, or Pennsylvania. That's what the Pennsylvania part means. And as a kind of a result of those egalitarian views, it talks about the diversity that flourishes in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to be more welcoming towards minority religious groups such as the Amish, who are still largely based out of Pennsylvania. Mennonites will settle over there. Native Americans. Mentions that he has harmonious relationships with Indians because he's going to treat them more fairly, largely from those Quaker views. So unique place there in Pennsylvania. Then our own Carolina, most of us, Carolina, started as one colony. I saw it named for King Charles, and I always wondered, growing up, I thought Charles II sounds nothing like Carolina, but it's that Latin root. Carolus is the Latin word for Charles. That's why Carol's the female equivalent of that name of Charles or Carl. And the Carolinas are founded in the late 1600s. The northern region is going to be slower to develop, largely because of these barrier islands of the Outer Banks. It's hard to get into the ports of North Carolina. There's Wilmington kind of down to the south, but Charleston and South Carolina ports are very easy to work with for people coming by ship, which is how all the transportation was done at that point. So the southern district is going to grow more. They'll have some run-ins with Native Americans as they spread, as it mentions there, enslaving Native Americans as well. So some major problems with the Yamasee troop and the Yamasee War down on the coastal area in the early 1700s. But there's also a problem with growing slavery in the South Carolina region. And it mentions this Barbados connection on page 99. Barbados is going to be way down here, so a long way from South Carolina, but a prosperous English colony in the Caribbean that grew a lot of sugar. And the English had slaves there. A lot of the people who settled, the wealthy people who settled in South Carolina, will be former residents of Barbados who bring their slaves and slave traditions with them. And so South Carolina is going to become a cruel plantation society, a cruel place for slaves to be treated, but mentions how rice becomes such an important crop in South Carolina, as they see the West Africans growing that in the coastal regions. Then it goes on to mention more about Virginia and how things are changing there, and it mentions this pretty serious incident 100 years before the American Revolution called Bacon's Rebellion, which is pretty much going to be like a civil war in Virginia. So scary time. You've got these two cousins, Nathaniel Bacon and William Berkeley are cousins, and they Bacon is he's a rich guy, but he's a late comer to Virginia. And what that means is that the good land on Virginia has pretty much been soaked up. Berkeley doesn't want to get into conflicts with Native Americans. It mentions there had been many problems with the natives, such as the Susquehannocks. No, I won't make you spell that on the test. But what they had kind of decided on is that the Indians would stay more to the left kind of region, and the colonists would stay more to the right. Well, Bacon is not for that. For one thing, he's kind of an arrogant English guy. He thinks they should be able to settle wherever they want to, and certainly thinks the Indians are inferior and that the Virginians shouldn't be allowing them to have that land. And Berkeley is saying, we're not going to go into this area and risk another conflict with people's lives. But Bacon, with the support of what it's calling these freedmen, people who had been indentured servants, they served those 4 to 7 years and then they earned their freedom. Well, they wanted land too, and what was happening is that people were saying, sorry, we're out of land over here. So Bacon leads a lot of these freedmen, these freed indentured servants, on an attack on the Indians in Virginia. It's a very dramatic conflict. Bacon will later burn down the city of Jamestown. So this major, imagine if the state capitol was suddenly burned down. It would be all over CNN and Fox News and everything else. It was a major act of terrorism and violence, and that's what happened. So scary stuff happening. And for all of this build-up with Bacon's rebellion, it ends kind of anticlimactically. Bacon dies of dysentery soon after this, not a pleasant way to go, and Berkeley is called back to England. But as a result of this, there have been some connections made just within the past 20 years or so about the increase in the number of slaves in Virginia right after Bacon's rebellion. And it talks on page 102 about these statutes on slavery that have been added throughout the 1600s. And then by the late 1600s, slavery is firmly in place. Virginia becomes a slave society. That wording of not a society where if you drive around with your imaginary car, because they didn't have cars then, that you would, every once in a while in a society with slaves, you would see a slave. A slave society is one in where slavery is firmly entrenched. And Virginia has been changing these rules. Slavery historically had always been people captured in warfare or people of a different religion, but now it's becoming more permanent. As of 1662, if your mother is a slave, so even if you were mixed, born to a slave mother and a freed man, or a white man and a slave woman, you will be enslaved. And then also a lot of slaves have been, when this idea that if they were of a different religion they could be enslaved, well, a lot were converting to Christianity. So in 1667 Virginia said, sorry, that's not going to excuse you from bondage. But with fewer indentured servants coming, because there's nothing really worth it for them with the good land dried up, more and more people are going to bring slaves over to do the work for them. So that increases pretty dramatically there in Virginia. So it mentions more of those Virginia slave codes on page 104. Moves back up north then to New England. The instability up there, King Philip's War that's happening, has the halfway covenant on page 105, which is key because those, just like how you see churches that have tent revivals every couple of years. A revival is cyclical in nature. People kind of reach a religious height and then it sort of backs off and you need to be revived. So it's a cycle that you go through. New England was having a problem sustaining that, so they have the halfway covenant. Then King Philip's War, largely over those land interpretations, which we've mentioned before, that the natives, the concept of private property was something different to them than what the New England settlers had. So Metacom or Metacomet is this name that's sometimes written as, who had gotten, when it mentions they were under control of Plymouth, on page 106, he had asked them to change his name to Philip. So as he was head of that group, this major, very, very deadly war breaks out. So more scary stuff happening. It says 4,000 Indians killed, 1 out of every 25 of the English settlers killed. So a very brutal conflict. Metacom's wife and son are going to be sent into slavery down in Bermuda, I think. Bermuda or the Bahamas, always get those confused. So brutal affairs there. And it goes into more of the problems when James II ascends to the throne and will be overthrown. The English were concerned when James had married a Catholic woman and had a son that would be raised Catholic. They didn't want a Catholic king, and so they invited William and Mary. So this was James II's daughter and son-in-law, who was king of the Netherlands, the Dutch, at the time. They take over in this glorious revolution. And this was an exciting time in England because it was the idea now in place. These folks are forced to sign a Bill of Rights. But the king can't just do whatever he wants to do. But the role of the consent of Parliament and people is important. So there are these new ideas of rights and freedoms, and all those talks are going to be important as we start to move. The rights of Englishmen, that's what the colonists will think that they have as we go along to the American Revolution. Then it mentions more about the witchcraft that it started with. Again, lots of anxiety in New England, problems, people concerned about the decline of religion, people concerned about Indian conflicts like King Philip's War. So these accusations were very common. Most of the victims were women who challenged the norms, so like single women, women who held property, dark-skinned women. And some people, it says 20 were executed in 1692 up in Salem, Massachusetts. A lot of those confessions were, I thought I had a little picture, were done out of torture. So, did some of these people, maybe some of them confess to practicing this dark magic or trying to engage the devil, but again, this is kind of part of the problem why we say, okay, should you torture somebody to get answers? Because if it's going to stop the torture, then maybe people will say what they want to, especially if they're likely to die anyway. So it kind of leaves off with witchcraft, and then, I thought I had another slide, but I'll just have to listen to my boring voice and you can go through the pages. It's talking more, mention lots of wars and conflicts in the 1600s and 1700s. The French going up into Canada, establishing a lot of forts in that area and along the Mississippi River, New Orleans there. So we're setting up a conflict with France. And the Spanish haven't gone away either, as they're still down in Florida, and then as they're setting up a colonial outpost in New Mexico as well. So, and the Native Americans then being kind of stuck in between, trying to sort of play each side because that works best to their advantage, but they're in a losing battle. So we're setting up for more conflicts between these empires. We've got some ideas of liberty in the air. We've got the English colonies taking on more of an identity, and that's where we will stop with chapter 4, if I'm still, what's happened to my little stop button? Well, you can stop listening now if you want. I can't find my stop button. There it is. We're done.